那这就是 Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Are we good? If we're good, thank you very much. My name is Matsie Oki. I'll shortly be directing the program. I would like to welcome everyone who is here with us physically, but I would also want to extend my welcome to people on the virtual platform. Today, we are very delighted as the College of Law and as the university. We are excited because we are celebrating two things. Firstly, we are celebrating the African Union, which is celebrating 20 years this year. And you will see from the panel of our speakers that they are experts in different areas, from human rights to trade to other stuff relating to the African Union. But what I want to say today is that we are also celebrating Professor Babatunde Olaite Fagbaibo, who is a full professor at the College of Law, an NRF-rated professor, and a prolific writer. Professor Fagbaibo published a book, Transcending Member States, Political and Legal Dynamics of Building Continental Supranationalism in Africa. The book was published in September this year. There's been a series of book launches, and this is the second one. I would like to acknowledge college management, in absentia, the executive team and the deputy executive team. I would also want to acknowledge the presence of the two directors, the School of Law and the School of Criminal Justice, Dr. Aubrey Mantua and Dr. Lewham Morodi, college management who are here, the chair of departments, you ladies and gentlemen, and our virtual community. I would also want to acknowledge the presence of different ambassadors and their representatives, especially from Burundi and Russia and the others. I would also want to acknowledge Professor Fagbaibo's mother. We call her Mama Tunde, for lending us his son and for allowing us to interact with his son and Tunde's brothers and Tunde's sister and the relatives around and afar. This occasion is coming at a very relevant time when we are questioning the direction of the African Union. Are we going to support and strengthen the African Union, or are we going to see a number of mega super-regional powers? In his book, and I think today Professor Fagbaibo will tell us what are the underpinning topics that underlies his book. But I believe one of them is that we need to take an introspection and tell us whether supranationalism in Africa is something that is achievable. One of the chapters that I love so much is a chapter on copying and pasting the European Union. When scholars and students are fighting for decolonized education and questioning the Eurocentric nature of our curriculum, we are seeing that it seems, I'm not sure, I'm not an expert in the field, that the African Union copied and pasted European Union. And besides copying and pasting, the funding comes from European Union and others. Now the question is, are we ready to unshackle ourselves from this? And ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to be long. In the meantime, before we start with the program, I would like to welcome on stage the acting executive team represented by Dr. Lewham Morodi to come and welcome you so that you can sit, relax, and feel at home. Dr. Morodi, thank you so much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. Or are we still in the morning mood? Yeah. Madam Program Director, thank you so very much for the opportunity that you have afforded the College of Law.
The minute you started,
I know those are people in a virtual platform. Are we able to contain that? Thank you very much. Madam Program Director, the opportunity afforded is quite befitting for this special occasion. On behalf of the college management, under the stewardship of Professor Olaotsekole and Professor Farseni Buteli Namakonde, they have conveyed their message of support and of that of solidarity as well as of collegiality in as far as what you call the level of jubilation and the state of euphoria that we find ourselves in. It is quite unfortunate they could not be with us because they are engaged in other university businesses. As I welcome you all, colleagues, those who are in that individual stage and those who are present here. Indeed, it's a quite level of hybrid engagement, and we say special thanks to all of those of you who managed to put aside their valuable times so that they can be with us. Madam Program Director, as I indicated, that the stewardship and the deanship of this particular college is quite thrilled in witnessing the hard work that has been put in place by Professor Fakbaibio. When we release what you call this book titled Transcending Member State, what a feast to conclude the academic year of 2022 on such a note of a book launch. The Department of Public, Constitutional and International Law, under the leadership of Dr. Linde Lamhlongo, it must be cited that this particular department is not sitting on its laurels. This afternoon is smiling shyly at the excellent work that exhibited by Prof. We continued to be ensuring that the College of Law ran on the lap of luxury because of the extraordinary leadership that you always demonstrate in areas of research, academic citizenry, scholarship, which is quite envied in this contemporary space of research and publication. The book its timing has never been more appropriate than now as we decolonize and Africanize our curriculum to subscribe to the nation of transformation. We need more of such initiatives so that we'll be able to prescribe materials that are resonating with Africa in her totality. Madam Program Director, I'll just maybe take a request to take an extract from the book itself, which says to be that Africa currently or presently is going through one of the most critical phases of its integrative development. As indicated in the book, that the process started in 2015, then it has increased its efforts in the development of policies and practices that craft what we call the AAU in affording its broader powers in synchronizing and produce what we call obligatory rule books concerning the regional integration processes. Prof. Fakbayo, in his work, he poses quite critical questions. The one is that how supranational is the African Union? It's only when we buy that book that we'll be able to get those responses. The upshot of this is the presence of a sequestered decision-making policy body which takes binding decisions and responsible for the supervision and implementation of such verdicts. Considering the importance of nation states in worldwide real politics, the architecture of supranationalism includes states as being advantaged player in the incorporation of such developments. On behalf of the College of Law leadership, we would like to congratulate Professor on the launch of this important book in assisting and guiding AU when addressing regional and continental integrative processes. Madam Program Director, consent me to applaud the department and Professor for putting the interests of Africa way ahead of theirs. It is this very same department that places UNISA, the College of Law, on the international stage by parading her offerings with a sense of bravado, confirming our global status as a global player readily available to make its contribution very, very much significant. Professor Fakbaibo, we are very, very much grateful for the contribution that you are playing. We are actually looking for more. We know you are doing more, but even the dictionary or the lexicon can't be even be the space to explain or to describe what enough means. But your selfless nature, your ability also not only for your own progress, you are able also to take young and upcoming scholars under your wings. We are quite very, very much observable on that particular note, apart from in other spaces that we know that you operate. But it is also befitting for us to say, professors are persons who must profess. Professors are persons who must change the landscape of our country, the region, and the continent. More importantly, also at the global space. With those Africans in the diaspora, they are always be in the position or in the space of saying, how are we trying to communicate our findings empirically so to the development of Africa? If in Africa, also in the diaspora, I'm talking about Professor Hassan Tekete, also is one of those African scholars and Afrocentric in nature. Those are people that they never abandoned what Africa is all about. Let's stop copying what Europe has done, but we are able also to say, with our indigenous knowledge system, our epistemologies, we are able also to say Africa has what it takes. Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you all and say, feel free, relax. Madam Program Director, our dogs, they are being chained, particularly pit bulls. Yeah. Thank you very much. Feel free, and we look forward to that. And we saw also even the lineup of this particular program. It's quite salivating. We are going to quench our thirst. We are in that particular space of saying, let's exchange those notes and look also to say, how do we make Africa the better part of this particular continent, and ensuring that others also are coming to Africa and say, there's quite a lot that we can learn from Africa. Madam Program Director, on behalf of the Executive Dean of the College of Law, we are thankful and grateful and highly appreciative of that particular invitation. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so kindly, Dr. Marodi. And I would like to believe that at this point in time, if you are not free, you are now free. If you are a little bit stiff, you are now relaxing. And may I add that there's water and some cold drinks on my left-hand side. Feel free to grab one if you don't have. Feel free to go and grab a second one as well. Can I also indicate that the celebration is also broadcasted live on YouTube, on Teams, as well as on Facebook Teams and on UNISA Radio. Having said that, I would like to call Dr. Aubrey Mantua, the Acting Director of the School of Law, to come and introduce our speakers. Like we indicated before, we have few speakers online, 2 online, and we also have speakers with us here. And as you introduce them, once you are done, Dr. Mantua, can you please ask the speakers present to come on the podium where they will be talking from? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Program Director, and good afternoon. Matia is like a sister to me, and one thing she always makes sure she does is to make sure I always get the easiest role on the program. So I don't even have an opportunity to go looking for a standout quote from a Karl Marx, Malcolm X, and all those sort of people. So yeah, indeed, this feels like a family gathering. Tunde has become a brother to me, so yeah, it just feels really special to be here. But without wasting any more time, let me just get into my easiest task of introducing our speakers and the author, starting with Dr. Philani Muthembu. Dr. Philani Muthembu is the Executive Director at the Institute for Global Dialogue, an independent foreign policy think tank based in Tshwane, South Africa. Prior to joining the IGT, he pursued a joint doctoral program with the Graduate School of Global Politics and the School of International Studies at Renmin University, Beijing in China. The focus of his dissertation was on the rise of the emerging powers as sources of development cooperation in Africa, for which he was awarded magna cum laude. He co-founded the Berlin Forum on Global Politics, B4GP, a non-profit organization dedicated to the promotion of academic, expert, and public understanding of global politics, while completing his master's in international relations at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. He headed the academic development program for first-year students and was elected as the first independent candidate to the Student Representative Council. His recent publications include a single-authored book titled China and India's Development Cooperation in Africa, The Rise of Southern Powers, a co-edited book titled From MDGs to Sustainable Development Goals, The Travails of International Development, a co-edited book titled Africa and the World, Navigating Shifting Geopolitics, and a co-edited book titled Africa-China Cooperation Towards an African Policy on China. Our second speaker is Prof. Amos Sarumbe. Prof. Sarumbe is of international economic law and related aspects of international and property law and biodiversity field. He currently serves as the chair of Department Criminal and Procedural Law in the College of Law. He is an international trade law consultant for the African Union and the various regional economic communities. He is an adjunct professor of international economic law at the Trade Policy Training Center, Arusha, Tanzania, the University of Pretoria and the University of Western Africa and University of Mutare, Zimbabwe. He is also teaching international trade at the Thabo Mbeki African School of Public and International Affairs. Prof. Sarumbe has supervised a number of doctoral students to completion, 13, and master's students, 21, to completion, as well as published over 30 research outputs in high impact factor journals. He is a C2 NRF rated research and a member of Southern African Young Academic of Sciences. Prof. Sarumbe is also a serving member of the 14th Council of the National University of Lesotho. Our third speaker, who is online, is Dr. Philomena Apiko. Dr. Apiko is the head of the AU-EU relations at the European Center for Development Policy Management. She holds a Bachelor of Laws and Masters of Laws in Human Rights Law from the University of Cape Town, South Africa. She also has a Master of International Law and Economics from the World Trade Institute in Bern, Switzerland. Her work explores how the European Union and African Union can create a mutual beneficial and interest-driven partnership. She also focuses on the AU's international framework and governance agenda, the AU as a global actor, the African Continental Free Trade Area, and cooperation on health within the AU-EU partnership. Our next speaker is Professor Frans Viljoen. Prof. Viljoen is a professor of law and director of the Center for Human Rights Faculty of Law His area of research is regional human rights protection, with particular attention to the African Union Human Rights Standard, institutions and processes. He is the author of one of the leading texts on the African human rights system and is the founding editor of the African Human Rights Law Journal. He has served as visiting professor on the African human rights system at various universities in South Africa. He is one of the vice chairpersons of the Global Campus of Human Rights. In September 2021, he was elected as a member of the advisory committee of the UN Human Rights Council. Our next speaker is Dr. Hesfina Rukato, who's online also. Dr. Rukato is a development consultant based in Zimbabwe. She was appointed as board chairperson for Great Dyke Investment in 2014. She is also a board member for Cateva. Dr. Rukato worked as Deputy Chair of Staff in the Bureau of the African Union Commission Chairperson from October 2012 February to 2014. Prior to that, she worked as a consultant to the African Union Commission, the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at the University of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. In this capacity, she coordinated the first Tata Forum on Peace and Security in Africa. She also worked for the NEPAD Secretariat in South Africa for 8 years, first as the advisor for environment and tourism, and then for the last 3.5 years as Deputy Chair Executive Officer. From 2001 to 2002, Dr. Rukato worked for the South African government as the director for the World Summit on Sustainable Development Policy. Prior to that, she had worked for the Zimbabwean government, focused on sustainable development, politics, and peace and security. Our next speaker, panelist, is Prof. Tsepo Madlingozi. Prof. Madlingozi is the director of the Center for Applied Legal Studies at Wits University and an associate professor at the School of Law of the same university, where he teaches social justice and human rights. He holds master's degrees in both law and sociology, and he received his PhD degree from Big Bang University of London. He is a research associate at the Chair for Critical Studies in the Higher Education at Nelson Mandela University, and a visiting professor, International Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus and University Rotterdam. He is a co-auditor of South African Journal of Human Rights. He is a co-auditor also of Symbol or Substance, Socio-Economic Rights in Southern Africa, Cambridge, UP, and a co-auditor of Introduction to Law and Legal Skills in South Africa, second edition, Oxford, South Africa. He sits on the board of the following civil organizations: the Rural Democracy Trust, Mining Affected Communities in Action, Women Affected by Mining Action, and Africa Ikalafe Spiritual Health Institute. He is also a member of the steering committee of the African Coalition for Corporate Accountability and a member of the advisory board of Health Justice Initiative. For 13 years, from 2015 to 18, he worked with and for Khulumani Support Group, a 120,000 strong social movement of victims and survivors of apartheid, as National Advocacy Coordinator and later the chairperson. We always hear when they say, save the best for last. A lot of the times it doesn't make sense. So I think today it will make a lot of sense. Finally, and for the main reason why we are here, colleagues, allow me to introduce to you Professor Babatunde Fagbayibo. Prof. Fagbayibo is currently a professor in law at the University of South Africa. He graduated with a doctoral degree in public law with specialization in regional integration law from the University of Pretoria, South Africa. His research primarily focuses on the institutional development of the African Union, in particular, the process of endowing AU institutions with supranational powers. Other research interests include African politics, transnational policy analysis, critical approaches to international law, and governance and democratization in Africa. He has written widely on these issues. He has acted as a consultant for the African Union on the issues of democratization and consultation governance. He also provides commentary in print and broadcast media on African affairs. He is a South African National Research Foundation NRFC 2-rated researcher. He was a visiting professor of law at the University of Lisbon, Portugal. Similarly, he has been invited to give lectures in institutions such as the University of Coimbra, Portugal, University of Pretoria, South Africa, University of Cambridge, United Kingdom, the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados, and Carleton University in Canada. He is the editor-in-chief of the Southern African Public Law Journal, SAPL. In addition, he is one of the editorial and advisory boards of the African Journal of Democracy and Governance and the Nigerian Yearbook of International Law. Thank you. Now I will request kindly that the following aforementioned come to the podium to sit on these couches here as part of our panelists. First is Professor Frans Viljoen, Dr. Pilani Mtembu, Prof. Amos Sarombe, Prof. Baba Tunde Fagbayibo, Prof. Tsepo Madlingozi. And as stated earlier, we have two panelists who are joining us online, and I will kindly request them to turn on their video. This is Ms. Philomonia Apiko, as well as Dr. Hesfina Rukato. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and Program Director.
Are we still good? Are we thirsty? If we're thirsty, this is the direction where you need to go. And then we'll go later this direction, right? Thank you, Dr. Aubrey Mantwa. I heard you saying, I'm a sister, and I give you easy roles. What everyone here doesn't know is that Dr. Mantwa is currently my line manager, but he has been seconded to another bigger position. He is now the director, so you can imagine the kind of instructions that I get from him as the COD, or chair of the department, as well as the director. He gets to choose where to fit in the program, and I'm a very scared person. Initially, Dr. Morodi said professors are people who should be able to profess. And I read a Facebook page, I'm not gonna mention people by names. One of the professors that we most know asked about the professors that we have, whether they professors or not. I don't know, I'm not a professor. Dr. Morodi also said that professors should be able to change the landscape. I can't even change a TV from one channel to another. So I found it befitting that the panelists who are so knowledgeable, who are experts, and who are professors, I'll have nothing to say. I wouldn't even hear a thing. So we've requested a good friend of us, myself and Tunde, Professor Tsepo Madlingozi, to be able to lead the discussion. Professor Madlingozi will be calling the speakers to the podium. And after the speakers have had a share of their 10 minutes presentation, Professor Madlingozi, with his good ear of changing the landscape, he had just even questioned what is happening on the panel, saying in terms of him as an expert in social justice, if you don't have a female here, there's something wrong. I'm not an expert, but I believe that because he has a good ear, he will be able to engage our speakers. And Professor Madlingozi, when you get to the conversation with the panelists, you will be assisted by Advocate Makama and Advocate Muchumi to check the chat box if there's some questions there. And they will also bring the roving mic next to you. And I'll come back very late in the program when important people have spoken. Over to you, Professor Madlingozi.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are running a little bit late. It's now almost 4 o'clock. So I'm gonna be very tight with the speakers. Each of the speakers has got only 10 minutes. to give us a punchlines, not a whole speech, just some overview in terms of their area of specialization. So without wasting time, I'm going to call Professor Frans Viljoen, who is going to address us on the AU's human rights architecture. Professor Viljoen, please.
Thank you very much, and Program Director, Professor Fakbayibo. I will take from your book the notion of building and mention what I consider to be 4 building blocks, how a genuinely supranational human rights architecture would look like, and then briefly assess where we are in Africa within the African Union according to those 4 pillars. The first pillar for me is that there should ideally be an extensive, binding, autochthonous framework that protects human rights, and that framework should be widely, continentally accepted. This framework that has widespread acceptance then would serve as a guidance that seeps through to the domestic level and would be transcending member states towards greater supranationalism. How have we fared? Obviously, in 1963, when the OAU was formed, there was no human rights treaty in place whatsoever. For, I think, understandable reasons. We then have, in 1981, the African Charter being adopted as a genuinely autochthonous human rights treaty with collective rights, the first international treaty to make justiciable the right to development, and also socio-economic rights made justiciable. The African Commission, which was established then, develops the standards further through soft law instruments, thematic resolutions, guidelines, and so on. And later on, the progression that has taken place is consolidated within the African Union Constitutive Act of 2000. The African Commission then further built on this network of norms by adopting general comments. That's a recent phenomenon, general comments on the right to life, for example, a general comment recently on how states should regulate private actors that are involved in the provision of social services at the national or domestic level. The African Commission and other role players have also pushed for the adoption of protocols to further make extensive these norms. We have the Maputo Protocol that has wide ratification, but also a further 3 protocols, one on older persons, one on persons with disabilities, assistance and security. We also have an ongoing process towards a protocol on nationality and eradication of statelessness. The point here is that, yes, we have a relatively extensive network of norms in place. And it is a plus that the African Charter, the core instrument, is in fact, has been adopted, has been ratified and accepted by 54 out of the 55 member states. So I think in terms of the first criterion that I postulate, there is a great advance towards supranationality. The second is that there should be a strong, independent mechanism that works towards supervising the human rights records of states, and that this mechanism, this strong independent mechanism's authority should be accepted as binding by the states concerned. In this respect, we do also note that in 1963, the OAU did not create a human rights body. As such, there were discussions earlier in 1960, the Law of Lagos, but it was only in 1987 that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights had come into being. So we've seen over time a kind of sacrosanct principle of non-interference being eroded and being replaced by the acceptance of African states, members of the OAU at the time, of this independent oversight mechanism. Now we know that the African Commission was later complemented by the African Court that came into operation in 2006. And here we find unequivocally that the states undertake to give effect to the judgments of the African Court. So while with the African Commission there was some debate about whether states have unequivocally accepted introspection in their domestic affairs, with the advent of the court, we have this very unequivocal principle that would underlie, I think, supranationality as understood in place. The downside is that only 33 states out of the 54 or 55 have ratified the African Court Protocol. In other words, have accepted this new bindingness of the African Court over human rights at the domestic level. The third criterion I would postulate would be that such supranational architecture would have procedures in place where processes emerge and lead to reform and redress at the domestic level, which would actually impact on the lives of people. In other words, there would be processes that would be lead to findings that would lead to legal reform and individual redress, which would be actually implemented by states. In this regard, I think we have seen great progress over time. The African Commission, many people at the time said, was designed to fail. It was a weak quasi-judicial body with very, I suppose, not explicitly defined powers. But the two main powers of the African Commission in terms of human rights, that to examine state reports and issue concluding observations, that power was really usurped, if you like, by the African Commission from the wording of the African Charter. And the second power of the African Commission, that of examining and giving remedies in individual cases, that also was quite contentious, and many understood the African Charter system to be focused more on massive violations, but the Commission kind of forged for itself a clear mandate. And the point is that states over the years, in the 35 years in which the African Commission has been in existence, states have acquiesced essentially to this enlarging power and competence of the African Commission. We have seen now that the African Court has complemented the African Commission's protective mandate, unequivocally, as we said, with binding authority. It does in court. The main mechanism through which cases really become to be decided by the African Court is also the direct access mechanism. And without going into too much detail, there is an optional mechanism that states can accept that individuals within these states, as many of you know, can bring cases directly to the African Court. Only 8 states at the moment have accepted that competence. So clearly that would be, if you like, the greatest advance towards fully fledged supranationalism that we would see within the architecture as it exists. We've seen 4 states making that declaration and then withdrawing it when they saw what the consequences had been: Rwanda, Burkina Faso, Rwanda, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, and Tanzania. Still, if you like, a work in progress. As far as the third criterion is concerned then, I think we have seen that there are procedures that allow for domestic reform in the light of the African Charter. There are remedies that are invocable and are being given effect to, but these are available only to a limited number of Africans within the member states. The fourth and last criterion would be that human rights should not be dealt with by the human rights bodies in isolation, but human rights should, in a genuinely supranational, human rights-minded intergovernmental organization, should be cross-cutting. All the organs of the intergovernmental organization should work towards upholding human rights. Ideally, the policy or the political organs should be exercising some form of sanction for non-compliance by member states for human rights violations. Now, on this score, I think we do see in the AU Constitutive Act many areas of overlap. We would expect the African Commission, the Pan-African Parliament, the African Union International Law Commission, for example, to work together on norm setting, on advancing standards. You would expect the African Commission, the African Court, and the Peace and Security Council to work together on massive human rights violations that relate to peace and security. And you'd expect, in terms of ordinary communications or cases, the African Commission, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, and the African Court to be working in synergy. Regrettably, I think of the 4 pillars, perhaps this is where Africa still is the weakest. I think there's a great lack of coordination and synergy between the various organs of the African Union in terms of advancing what essentially is a common agenda. And we see the establishment of the AGA, the African Governance Architecture platform, in a sense acknowledging that there is a lack of synergy and there is a need for greater coordination. But AGA has been, I think, not well resourced and has not become the vehicle to bring human rights into a cross-cutting focus within the African Union. The political actors also, the African Union Assembly and specifically the Executive Council, have not lived up to their roles of, if you like, bolstering the human rights agenda. Two examples. The one example is when states do not comply with judgments of the African Court, the Assembly, the Executive Council have shied away from mentioning any state by name. So there is no holding states accountable in any sense in the public domain for non-compliance with the court's binding judgments. And then lastly, an example of relative recent origin as well. Whereas the political organs are supposedly there to uphold the integrity and the independence of the African Commission Court and Committee, on two occasions, importantly, the independence has been subverted and eroded. I think all of us know about the Coalition of African Lesbians, a South African-based NGO, that had obtained observer status with the African Commission in 2015, but the Executive Council subsequently called on the Commission to withdraw that observer status because, in the view of the Executive Council, the Coalition of African Lesbians did not uphold African values in its mandate. The African Commission eventually relented and withdrew the observer status to the Coalition of African Lesbians, and kind of that rested, but at its most recent session, the African Commission again had been confronted with 3 NGOs who work in areas related to, let's call it, sexual orientation issues, and the Commission, in this instance, rejected the observer status of all 3 of these NGOs, in a sense internalizing, if you like, the reasoning that had been given by the political organs previously. The Commission in this case found and observed that these NGOs do not observe African values and that they could not be granted observer status because there is no explicit right related to sexual orientation in the African Charter. So again, I think this is a sign of how the politics, the embeddedness of the African Commission within the political context of the African Union and the kind of signals that had been sent by the political organs have led to an erosion of at least a very particular segment of rights holders within the African context. So to conclude, thank you, Chair, is just to say that I think looking at the supranational nature of human rights protection and architecture, there's no clear answer. Clearly there's a continuum, and the African Union is certainly moving towards greater supranationality, and I think as a consequence the potential for human rights is increased, but it remains a work in progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Franz. The next speaker is Ms. Philomena Apiko. Ms. Philomena Apiko, can you hear us? Please put on your video. Ms. Apiko. Is she online? IT? Okay. Welcome. You can go ahead, please.
Thank you so much. Firstly, I would like to thank Professor Fagbayibo and the UNISA College of Law for the invitation to speak at the launch of this intellectually invigorating book. And it's my pleasure to share some perspectives on the supranational dimensions of the AU reform efforts. As pointed out by Prof. Fagbayibo in his book in chapter 4.4, the politics of reform and the theme of reform have been a recurring component of the AU since its formation. The issue of African agency is at the core of the reform efforts, charting a course that is driven by African actors and contexts. For me then, the question is how best to achieve the Pan-African goal and what institutional model do we put in place. When one mentions AU reforms, I'm sure most of you will be thinking instinctively for the Kagame report of 2017. However, early efforts on reform go back to the days of the OAU, where a group of African leaders, for example, Kwame Nkrumah, subscribed to what some authors have called a Big Bang approach to African integration, even if this meant that the newly independent states had to cede sovereignty to a Pan-African supranational structure, including the Pan-African Parliament, the Pan-African courts, as well as an African government. On the other hand, of course, we had some leaders who felt that it was too soon to speak about supranational Pan-African government, and let alone share the national autonomy with it. So they opted more for a gradualist approach in which integration must precede political integration, and strengthening the national order must precede a Pan-African construct. So today I would like to share 4 types of reform with you, some of my perspectives on some of the reforms. So the first one was the OAU to the AU. So without going into much detail about what really informed the move to the OAU to the AU, the summary being that the OAU had sort of served its mission, being to liberate Africans from colonialism, apartheid, and was due for replacement by a structure geared more towards economic integration, which is the current reality of the continent. Many of you are aware in the 1999 City Declaration, African leaders agreed to transform the OAU to AU, and mostly
Europe, Institute for African Studies, everybody's running around trying to save Africa. But are we learning about our external parties? And I'm glad that South Africa, for example, of Africa, and someone was joking when Britain was going through its crisis, changing prime ministers, saying, this is a satire now, that the Center for the Study of Europe in Africa is convening a conference to understand the political issues in Europe, right? So, and those things are very, very important to understand the rest, and to also be able to train our people to be able to, negotiate with the rest. So, I mean, those are some of the things I think we need to look at. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's now go to the floor and take questions. Do you have another mic? Yeah, please go ahead. Introduce yourself before you ask the question. And let's keep it at one question, please. One question per, yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I have 4 questions.
One question.
Why are you limiting me to one? Okay. Thank you, Program Director. You're an enemy of progress, I must tell you. Anyway, my name is Tukolo. I just want to ask Apiko, I think, right?
We want rights, we want this, I can't do this. I think even